Hi, I'm Ranty Minority. Welcome back to my channel where I do social and political commentary. Today's video is going to be a little bit different today. Instead of my typical video where I debunk silly right-wingers, today we're going to be doing an interview with the author Peter Gelderloos. Peter Gelderloos is an anarchist author who's written several works which critique peaceful protests and protest methods. He's written works such as Worshipping Power, which I have in my hand. I read his book, How Nonviolence Protects the State, and it was a really good read, so I decided to reach out to Peter for an interview, so that's going to be today's video. Anyway, I'm babbling. Hope you guys enjoyed the interview. Be sure to leave a comment, like, and subscribe if you're new, and enjoy. Oh, how's it going, Peter?
Hey, how's it going?
Just getting this recording set up now. We should be good this time. Sorry about last time.
No worries.
Yeah. For the viewers, last time we tried to record, turns out iPhone doesn't record video call or any audio call, so I found that out the hard way. That was a little nudge in the plans, but thankfully Peter agreed to do it again, so here we are. Could you give the audience a little bit about yourself and tell us who you are?
Yeah, so my name is Peter Gelderloos. I'm a writer and an anarchist that participate in various social movements. I'm originally from Virginia, but for the last dozen years or so I've been living in Catalonia, in the Spanish state.
Gotcha. So for the ones who are unfamiliar, what is an anarchist in simple terms?
Anarchism is a rejection of all coercive hierarchies. So capitalism, the state, patriarchy, racism. It's the idea that every person is the one who's most suited to organizing their own life horizontally together with others. And it's a belief that there needs to be an agreement, like a connection between means and ends. That freedom isn't some far-off destination that you can use any means in order to arrive at, but that in order to be free, in order to live well, that's a revolution that starts right now in how we try to achieve that.
I got you. So what would an anarchist society look like if you've ever seen one, or you have any idea of what that would look like in real time?
Yeah, an anarchist society would be really the phrase that Zapatistas use applies really well. A world with many worlds. So every specific community would have to decide how to organize themselves, and that has to happen in accordance with their history, with their traditions, with their specific needs, their local bioregion, like the specific environment where they exist. And then they would coordinate with neighboring communities in order to meet the needs that they could meet more easily on a larger scale as opposed to a smaller scale, although of course most power would be at that local level, just at the level of individual people, families, communities. So anarchism doesn't offer a blueprint. It doesn't offer any kind of easy solution or global answer of, this is what freedom has to look like. It rather seeks to give people tools to build their own freedom. So it really would have a lot of diversity, and it would have to look different from one place to the next, just because people's needs are different.
Yeah, so there's no there's no clear cut way of how it will look. It's like depending on the society, basically.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, I get that. So you wrote a book called How Nonviolence Protects the State, and it's basically a critique on peaceful protests in America and a little look over the world. That inspired me to reach out to you, and I want to know what inspired you to write that book at the time. Was there anything going on that really pushed you to, you need to write this immediately?
Yeah, so in 2001 there was September 11th, and then the push to invade Afghanistan and the push to invade Iraq. So I was participating in the anti-war movement, the movement against military recruitment, against those invasions, and those were movements that were overwhelmingly and exclusively nonviolent. So just to be clear, when I criticize nonviolence, I'm not criticizing any tactic that no one could possibly classify as violent. I think every social movement inevitably uses a diversity of tactics and methods, sometimes more effectively than others. So when I talk about nonviolence, I'm talking about this idea that a person or a group has the right to declare that only these tactics can be used in this movement, and to kick out other people who don't agree with that, even if that means denouncing them in the media, turning them over to the police, which is something that happens quite frequently. So at the time, proponents of this exclusive nonviolence had a real stranglehold over the movement. And it's useful to point out that this was the largest protest movement in human history. You got more people coming out the streets than at any other moment in human history, and it was completely ineffective. A lot of people, because there's this history of whitewashed histories, so there's this tendency of whitewashing history.
And to be clear, this was a mostly peaceful protest, right?
Sorry, say that again?
To be clear, this was a mostly peaceful protest, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry. So, these anti-war protests in most of the world were actually exclusively nonviolent, and they failed to accomplish anything. They didn't stop the war, of course. Even though a lot of pacifist organizations at the time predicted that the U.S. would not be able to go ahead and invade Iraq because the protests had been so large and so peaceful. And that's a case of them kind of falling into their own mythology, because they have this tendency to whitewash histories of movements that did use a diversity of tactics and methods. And so, for example, they believed that the resistance to the Vietnam War was a victory for nonviolence, which it wasn't at all. There was a great deal of combative and forceful resistance. And so anyways, they didn't really realize that they weren't interested in any kind of self-criticism, and so they had the stranglehold over the movement, really killing it off and accomplishing nothing. And even to a certain extent within the anarchist movement, although much less so, there was a bit of this tendency to kind of suppress debate. So these double standards were used, where you could advocate nonviolent tactics, or this typical method of trying to convince people, oh well, this tactic is okay because technically this is also nonviolent. And there were not so many spaces where you could openly critique that, or talk about different histories and different methods of struggle. And so I guess in 2005, I wrote the first edition of How Nonviolence Protects the State, to try to just break open more space for debate, to share some of those criticisms, and a lot of them were criticisms that had already been made in other contexts a long time before, like from Ward Churchill or from Frantz Fanon. So, and I just wanted to help spread those.
Oh, I love Fanon. I just recently started reading him. I was forced to read him in an English class, and it's funny because I would have never knew about him, but at the moment I hated it. But I was like, oh, this guy's actually saying some pretty base stuff. And now I have
Very relevant today, yeah.
now I have like 4 of his books on my bookshelf. So it's a good thing I learned about him. Is there anything you wish you knew before writing How Nonviolence Protects the State?
Very much, yeah. I ended up actually writing a second book, sort of a follow-up, The Failure of Nonviolence, and that kind of updates the critique more, includes more examples from movements that happened after 2005. So like the beginnings of this anti-racist, anti-police movement that, of course, has gotten very big. Things related to the movement of the squares or Occupy, and just the color revolutions also happening mostly in like former Soviet bloc countries. Specific critique of Dean Sharp's methodology, and yeah. So How Nonviolence Protects the State is the first book that I wrote, and there was a lot of plenty of things obviously that I still don't know, and even more so then. So it's definitely a first book, but I'm glad that people still find it useful. But like I said, I did write a follow up to kind of bring it more up to date.
I got you. Have your views changed any since How Nonviolence Protects the State, or the more recent book, The Failure of Nonviolence?
Yeah, I'd say my views are always changing. One big thing I would say is that in How Nonviolence Protects the State, a lot of the histories of anti-capitalist movements and whatnot are very much influenced towards these larger, more mediatic or spectacular groups, like Weather Underground or Red Brigades or so on and so forth. And oftentimes in the histories, these books kind of stand in for much broader, more diverse, and very, very multitudinous movements. And really we're dealing with groups of just like a few dozen or a few hundred people who kind of become the symbol for the whole movement when really there were many different currents and different ideas about how to resist in those movements. And one great example is the Weather Underground. I mean, this was a group of like a couple dozen at most students from elite universities who somehow kind of became a symbol for the resistance against U.S. imperialism, against capitalism, when they weren't even carrying out 1% of all of the actions that were happening in those years. And they get attention because they sought attention, and also because, these were like elite students from the upper crust. So I didn't really have a lot of those resources when I wrote How Nonviolence Protects the State. I didn't know all those histories. So one thing that I definitely don't agree with so much is this focus on history that gives all of the attention to these groups that a lot of times also are actually the vanguardist authoritarian ones.
I got you. So what was the response like? Was it mostly positive when you first released it?
It was a mix, from hate mail to misrepresentations, to legal threats, to appreciation, to really good debates. It felt like, at least within a lot of my circles, it kind of broke the ice and allowed for a lot more debate, spread a lot of criticisms. Also, I met a lot of people who had had similar feelings and similar criticisms, who appreciated it. Overall, I think just events moved on. I think it was a book that was sort of lucky with its timing, just because in the years that followed, it became more and more difficult for proponents of nonviolence to make their arguments, just because they were coming from this period in which social movements in a lot of places around the world were quite weak. And so most people didn't really feel that we had the strength to fight back, to defend ourselves, to have a movement that also had the possibility for carrying out illegal actions like sabotage or things like that. So it was much easier for proponents of nonviolence to maintain this hegemony, basically just based on our own weakness and based on this fear that we couldn't do anything else. Obviously, in 2020, it's completely different. But even just 10 years ago, a lot of social rebellions had happened in countries around the world, and even increasingly in North America and Europe. And so it was just easier to spread these critiques of nonviolence.
I got you. So were the critiques mostly from anarchists, Democrats, Republicans, or is it kind of all over the place?
But like the perspective the critiques are coming from?
Yeah.
So I'm an anarchist. I write as an anarchist. I try to write things that will have a wider relevance, or that could be interesting for people regardless of what their political labels are. So yeah, like all the critiques are maybe consistent with anarchism, like focusing on fighting authoritarianism, on like a vision of revolution that goes beyond just economic considerations, also to look at how people organize their own lives, to look at this symphony between means and ends. But I try to talk about things with a broader relevance, so looking at connections between like sexism in our movements, racism in our movements, and also these structures whereby the system itself, whereby the ruling class kind of keep their claws in our movements. So you'll have wealthy white progressives from New England giving a lot of money to the civil rights movement, and even the Ford Foundation, but of course they're only giving money to the parts of the movement that frighten them less. So they're trying to reproduce reformist demands within the movement, which will just kind of update the system or change the masks of the system, and actually make it easier to carry out this really bloody repression that was going on against the movement, like seen in COINTELPRO, against the Black Panthers, against the American Indian movement. And nonviolence was like a really important part in that like transmission belt, or that relationship that allowed those who benefit from oppression to influence the very movements against that oppression.
Okay.
So yeah, I was writing as an anarchist, but the attempt was definitely to write something that would be relevant to anyone who cares about fighting patriarchy, fighting white supremacy, fighting capitalism.
Yeah. Well, for those of you who are unfamiliar, COINTELPRO was an FBI operation where they attacked several, I believe it was several, not just Black Panthers, it was several political organizations that were anti-war, pretty much liberal organizations where there's a lot of murders done. I don't know all the details, but what was the second thing you mentioned?
The American Indian movement. They infiltrated dozens of groups. They kept files on thousands of people. Yeah, there's a good documentary book by Jim Vanderwall and Ward Churchill on COINTELPRO.
Yeah, you should send that to me. I should put it in the description. Thank you. What's a misconception about your views as an anarchist? A lot of people think anarchy is just letting society run wild and it's fire and brimstone everywhere and there's mob rule. So what's another misconception?
Yeah, when the media talk about anarchy, they're usually talking about actually the moments in which state power is the most naked. So in a war zone where there's no clear ruler, but two different ruling structures are fighting with one another for power, or a situation where you have mafia control. In a lot of cases, states actually start out as mafias. States are basically mafias that get a monopoly on authority and on the legitimate use of violence. So this is just another one of these, kind of like the way like a lot of white people, how they're responding to Black Lives Matter or the decolonization movements, is this crazy fear that they're all going to get burned out of their homes or they're going to get lynched or something like that, which is exactly what either they did or their political cultural forebears did. So there's this.
It's very ironic.
Like the heart of authority, there's this deep-seated fear that everyone else is going to be as evil as authority itself is, and that when the shoe's on the other foot, people are going to use the same kinds of like torture and carpet bombing and just mass murder that governments use regularly. And that for me is another important argument for anarchism, is that if we use tactics like that, we'll never be free. But there's a huge difference between people who are historically oppressed fighting back, defending themselves, people who have been exploited their entire lives, taking over what they need in order to have a dignified existence, and fighting back against the institutional forces that try to make that impossible. There's a huge difference between that and like systematically putting people in cages, torturing people, invading countries and killing thousands or millions of people. And that's one of the problems with this whole dichotomy of violence and nonviolence, is that violence is such a vague, ambiguous term that all of these very unlike activities get put in the same box. There is nothing at all in common between like an F-16 pilot or a drone operator and someone who's risking themselves fighting, pushing the police back, burning down a police station after yet another police murder. Those are just completely different activities. What were we talking about?
Yeah, problem. So what were your views like before becoming a self-proclaimed anarchist? Were you more Democrat before, or were you more apolitical?
Neither. I wasn't a Democrat. I wasn't apolitical. When I was a lot younger, if I hadn't found any way past like this political binary, then I more often definitely tend to sympathize with progressive causes until like someone was able to make it clear to me, either like through a book or like a friend in conversation, that was just a way of kind of changing the masks of power, of like updating the problem rather than solving it. Growing up in the 80s and 90s, like there were not strong social movements where I was living in the U.S., so I did feel like a pretty broad rejection of the society that I knew, and it was very clear that it was a society founded on hypocrisy and oppression. And so I felt this rejection to that, but I didn't even know that other anarchists existed. So it took a while to kind of find this collectivity of resistance.
I gotcha. So, what are your thoughts on this media push of rioting and looting of BLM? Most of the protests are peaceful, yet, most of the things you read about BLM will be framed as rioting and looting. Do you think that has anything to do with the whitewashing you speak of history and these types of things?
What's most concerning to me, or and also maybe most relevant, is like you mentioned this, like the narrative around violence between what's happening in the streets and what's happening in the media. But there's also this other layer about how what people are doing in the streets is conditioned by the media, by the police. The very first few days after George Floyd was murdered, if you remember, outside of Fox News, there weren't a lot of media that were willing to openly condemn the rioting. They realized that this had happened before, that it was practically inevitable, and that if they sympathized with some shopping mall or some police building more than they sympathized with at this point just the thousands of people, mostly black and other racialized people who've been murdered, that was just very clearly support for a white supremacist system. So at the very beginning, the approach was more sort of like this, recognizing that this was a pressure valve, hoping that it would blow off soon, and saying a few empty words about racism, making symbolic changes that won't really affect the racist reality of the country. And then it was only like after a few days that they started changing that. First off, by spreading the rumor that it was white supremacists who were responsible for looting.
Or Antifa.
There was like some police provocation. So the first way that they tried to delegitimize the rioting and the looting was indirectly. It wasn't by saying that it was amoral, because if they did that, they would have no ground to stand on if they're trying to say that property is more important than life. Instead, they tried to portray it as something insincere, something dangerous, something in fact connected to white supremacy, connected to fascists or the police. And only after they encouraged people to start sharing video footage of those who were rioting, and actually got a number of people put in prison, were they able to come in and insist on these peaceful protests, which really are only in the interests of the Democratic Party. We already know from years and years of experience that police only get fired or charged if there's riots or the threat of riots.
Yeah, someone finds out, basically.
On a very basic level of self-defense, people know what they have to do, and they're not stupid. But of course, the Democrats, they don't want to be associated with this revolutionary movement. They're still trying to attract this center, which doesn't exist in the U.S. anymore. Like the age of having this where the majority has centrist politics that died when Trump got elected, if not earlier. Now society is very polarized. So, it's not going to do anything to stop police killings. The Democrats are taking a very strong stance against defunding the police. So they're the ones, I think, they're the ones who have, so different people can have different motivations, of course, for wanting protests to be peaceful. Sometimes, the thing that you most want to do is just, something more like a vigil. But without a doubt, those who have the most resources, who want the entire movement to be peaceful, is the Democratic Party. And so they had very, very underhanded methods to kind of assert that control in the movement. And there's been a lot of critiques coming out about that whole process, like by Yanni Tivani Marshall, Idris Robinson, and hopefully you can share the links to some of those articles and podcasts.
Thank you. Do you think we're moving in the right direction with the protests and everything that's going on? Do you think it's going to get any type of change, or do you think we're still a long way from getting any actual things done?
I think we're a long way. We're also right in the middle of it. In the U.S., it started this mainstream conversation about abolishing the police. Like, it got everybody talking about abolishing the police. Of course, the media is doing their best, and the NGOs, to control that conversation, to shift it, to disarm it. but that's still huge. Like, if you look at what social conversations have been like in the U.S. over the last couple decades, the fact that this very revolutionary proposal could be forced on the table, that's really meaningful. And it's also spread internationally. I mean, police are a problem everywhere. They're particularly bloody in the U.S., but everywhere that there are police, they kill people with greater or lesser frequency. And also, white supremacy is part and parcel of capitalism, and capitalism is a global system. So racist police are a problem everywhere, and this movement has actually spread and made waves in France, in the UK. It's connected to ongoing long time movements in Chile, in Colombia, and that's really important. Also, to get this more international wave of revolutionary movements, which is also something that we were seeing pretty dramatically in 2019. Because if you have a revolution in just one country, it gets choked out, it gets crushed. So on the one hand, that's a really huge advance, and we can talk about revolutionary things that are happening right now. On the other hand, yeah, we're a really long way off. A significant part of the U.S. population is really just digging their trench, arming themselves, killing people for protesting, killing people they disagree with, and there's probably more killings to come for sure. And for in the meantime, there's not like a strong left in most places, and that's neither a good thing nor a bad thing. It's complicated because a strong left is more likely to be able to institutionalize the movement and just kind of sidetrack it into these reformist demands that won't make real changes. But then on the other hand, that means that you have like this powder keg. You have a situation where the pressure is just growing. The police are systematically unable to stop murdering people. Everyone's going to be videotaping it these days, so just every month or two you're going to have another recorded police murder that goes viral, that causes more of these conflicts, and that just completely destroys any semblance of social peace in the U.S., or social peace being sort of the lie that there's consent to govern, the lie that within a democracy you have this basic consensus and this basic cooperation, and that people are free and they can cooperate with one another to get their needs met. So more and more it's becoming clear that social peace is the piece of the graveyard. And who knows what's going to happen as that pressure mounts. But it's definitely a very violent situation, and that's worrying. It's dangerous. And people are doing the best they can over there in the States, over here, and other places to resist, to defend themselves. But it's complicated, and it's pretty historic seeing a situation in which the system is very clearly broken. Most of the ruling class is aware that their system is broken, but they haven't yet been able to even come up with convincing proposals for changes. I mean, the ruling class today, they weren't adults the last time the system had to make serious concessions to the people on bottom. So they're not really in a mindset where they can make serious reforms that might temporarily, at least for the next few decades, make this problem go away. So it's a powder keg.
I got you. So you go to lots of protests, I hear.
I try to avoid the whole kind of riot tourism tendency, which it certainly has therapeutic value, like being in the streets with people, being able to like assert our strength collectively, being able to take over space.
Yeah.
These are amazing feelings. They do wonders for one's mental health. Fanon talked about that also in a different context, of course. But like revolutions, in order to have any chance of success, they need to be global, and so I think it's more important to participate where we are, or where we know, where we have connections, to try to make these things spread. Attempts to get this anti-police, anti-racist movement to spread in the Spanish state have not been so successful. It's definitely several steps behind in that regard. So, I do participate in protests and in movements generally where I live, and I go back to visit the States fairly often. And there's been moments that have been extremely interesting with a whole lot of rebellion, and then there have been moments that have been much more dead or divided or immobilized, and you just gotta roll with it and do the best you can.
Yeah, what was one of the more eventful ones you've been to?
So there was a general strike in the Spanish state in 2012, and prior to that, with just a few exceptions, society was becoming more and more pacified. The police were really increasing their control over the streets, making it impossible to do anything without a permit, making it impossible to take over space. And in this general strike, it was huge. Hundreds of thousands of people came out into the streets, and they did it in an independent way, because the big labor unions here are a lot like the big labor unions in the U.S., where they're not really interested. They're certainly not interested in revolution, and they're not even really interested in empowering workers. They more basically just make a lot of money serving as like the managers for workers' protests. So basically just making deals for the bosses. And people rejected those bureaucratic unions, those mainstream unions. They either organized in neighborhood assemblies, or more informally, or with some smaller, more radical, more independent labor unions. And we just took over everything, and it was just a really great feeling. Like people, mostly people who didn't have any experience, who didn't really know how to take over space in the streets, or how to have these more self-organized and combative protests. Like seeing people learn. And just in the course of the day, from like the morning until the afternoon, like you could see how quickly collective intelligence can really advance. And so that ended with barricades all throughout the city. Speaking of one specific experience, even though it was definitely a countrywide thing. So the city where I was, barricades all across the city. The economy completely shut down, and just like this palpable feeling of joy, through all the crowds.
So awesome. Where was that?
Barcelona.
Brooklyn. I have to look into that. So you seem to have this kind of, I don't want to say disdain, or rather not so great view of moderates who go to these protests and try to preach to people of color about peaceful protests. And you talk a lot about in how Nonviolence Protects the State and the Failure of Nonviolence, how they use Martin Luther King or some insert black activist here. What exactly is your issue with that and using those people to like push a peaceful frame of things?
In how Nonviolence Protects the State, I quote like friends and comrades who are. Oh yeah, let me start that answer over if you don't mind. Is that right?
Say again?
Can I start that one over?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So in How Nonviolence Protect the State, I quote several movement participants, including friends and comrades, who really identify, like if we're specifically speaking about like white moderates, who identify the way Martin Luther King gets used by white people or by institutions, by NGOs, in order to define what's acceptable resistance and what's not. I mean, obviously, MLK was a complex figure. He also, radicalized quite a bit later in life. But the quotes that are mass-produced are not the ones, they're not the ones coming from, his more anti-capitalist campaigns. They're more like cliches that are telling people practically, turn the other cheek. And so I think it's definitely problematic when white people try to define for other people what's acceptable resistance, or when they take a very, very powerful, diverse and complex movement and reduce it just to one historical figure who also happens to be, or they reduce it in a way that really protects their own interests.
Yeah, speak as if he was the only person speaking during the time period.
Sorry, say that again?
They speak as if he was the only person during this time period that was advocating for change. Where many people other than him who were pushing for change in different ways that weren't as peaceful that also got things done.
Yeah, exactly.
I think it's a really weird thing people do. So, are you on the side of defund the police, abolish the police, or neither?
I think, yeah, it's definitely important to talk about abolishing the police. And since the police are such an integral part of capitalism and of the state, for me, that's a way to start talking about abolishing the state, which, of course, I believe in as an anarchist. When this rebellion started, people were talking about abolishing the police, and very, very quickly, NGOs and progressives stepped in to change that to defunding the police, because it doesn't make sense to, 15% abolish the police. That's a completely incoherent proposal. But once you've changed out the vocabulary and you're talking about defunding the police, then all of a sudden you can say, oh, we defunded the police by 15%. And so that's a coherent proposal, at least logistically, even though it's not what people were, at least from what I understood and from what I heard, what people were talking about in the beginning. So, hey, if people can get like specific police units disbanded, then that's a good thing. But it's not so much a good thing if that works to pacify and to neutralize the movement. The United States is a country that's based on white supremacy. It's based on genocide and colonialism and enslavement. And the police, we've seen, even in these really hot moments where these riots keep popping off, they just can't stop themselves. They just can't stop it. Every day there's another police murder. Every week or so there's another one that gets recorded on video, and that's what they do. That's what their role historically has been in the U.S. And there's no reforming that. Capitalism, likewise, it's destroying the planet. The whole West Coast is burning to ash. More species are going extinct. Like millions of people are actually dying from things related to the destruction of the planet, with more famines, more droughts, more disease, more extreme weather events. And there are people who are making billions of dollars off of this, and they're the ones who are trying to sell us the solutions right now. And the police are also there to protect that. Like, it's you have like a factory in your area that's polluting your water, polluting your air, or they're trying to build an oil pipeline, upstream of you. Shutting that down is self-defense, and it's common sense. And the police are there to prevent you from exercising your self-defense, to prevent you from making a healthier world in which everyone can be free, in which everyone can have an opportunity for a dignified life. So yeah, they need to be abolished. We would live better without them.
What do you think a community with no police will look like?
Well, we've had some recent examples. In 2005, there was a teachers' strike in Oaxaca in southern Mexico, and they were just organizing a strike like they did every year, but the police attacked it really brutally, and just folks were pissed off, and there was this response that went through the whole city, and people built barricades, they took the streets, and they pushed the police out of the city. So most of Oaxaca state was autonomous. It was free for about 5 months, including Oaxaca City, which is a city of 500,000 people. So it's not huge, but it's by no means small. And people actually started these assemblies at the barricades. So every street needed a barricade in the first instance to defend itself, because the people who were a threat to them, it wasn't criminals or delinquents or whatever. It was the cops, and it was the paramilitaries that the government was sending after them. So they started these barricades, and they met their neighbors at the barricades, and the barricades became the central point for these assemblies that worked in a really effective way, because they were decentralized and they covered the entire territory. So you had small assemblies for every block that had a small enough scale that people could talk face to face, they could organize themselves fluidly, and then for things that concern the entire neighborhood, they federated, and they had like a larger assembly for the whole neighborhood, and then like a big assembly for the entire city, for folks to come from all the different little assemblies. And it worked like that for 5 months until the military got sent in, organizing themselves. So on the one hand, when you see your neighbors, when you talk face to face with your neighbors, that gives you an opportunity to deal with the things that are dealt with by the criminal justice system that actually constitute some form of harm. because a lot of the things that are punished by the criminal justice system are not harming any person. They're harming some corporation maybe, or just like no one at all. And this didn't come up earlier, but looting, for example, is it's one of the most effective forms of wealth redistribution that people can put together spontaneously, quickly, and in a situation in which so many people are out of work and not a lot's being done to make sure that folks can make it to the end of the month, that folks have food to eat and all the rest.
When you say looting is wealth, sorry to interrupt you. When you say looting is wealth redistribute, whatever the word was, I can't speak. What do you mean exactly by that? I've heard that term I've heard that phrase used before, and I just want it to be explained for me and also the viewer.
Right. So the vast majority of social wealth is controlled by corporations. It's controlled by the very richest people. The statistics are easy to find, but roughly 90% of the social wealth is controlled by a very small group of people and banks and corporations, and we have to work for them to get just what we need to survive and a little bit extra. When we work, the majority of the value that we're producing goes up the chain. We don't get to keep it. But and a lot of times, a lot of these police murders are happening because some kind of store or business is calling the police for someone shoplifting or something like that. And which again that's a crime that's not, or like the employee, if it's like a big, like a Target or something like that, or most stores, like the employees are not getting hurt by someone shoplifting. It's the the CEOs, the people making the big paychecks. Cops come, they end up killing someone, and so then folks riot, they loot. You break a window, you get some new jeans, some shoes. You go into the pharmacy and get the medicine that they charge an arm and a leg for. You're improving your quality of life, and you're taking that from the very institutions that basically monopolize, that hoard it. These are like billionaire institutions that have like a great deal of wealth. And in Minneapolis, for example, a lot of people who are primarily poor and working people were able to spread around a lot of wealth that they didn't have to pay for. And you can either think that's legitimate, or you can think it's legitimate to basically have people starve to death or to die of treatable diseases because they don't make enough money to buy what they need. So those two different viewpoints are very much at odds. But I obviously agree with the former.
Yeah, I love that.
So really quick to finish that example, when you're talking with your neighbors face to face, you can start to deal with a lot of the problems that actually are related to some form of harm. Things related to addictive drugs, things related to gender violence or domestic violence. Those are things that punishment doesn't help. Punishment just continues those forms of harm. Prisons definitely don't make addictive drugs go away. They make it so people are more likely to stay addicted. Prisons make people more likely to be abusive. They're not making people less abusive.
They teach them to be better criminals, basically.
Yeah. So sorry, say again?
They teach them how to be better criminals also. You're surrounded by people who are also, criminals, so to speak, who have also been through the system. You're teaching them how to be better and not come back. But it doesn't seem to work because the recidivism in America is also very high. So it doesn't seem to be like rehabilitation in the slightest in America.
When people get out, it's very hard to get a job. So,
yeah.
So when you create solidarity among neighbors, then you create real first steps to deal with those actual forms of harm. And then another thing that they did in Oaxaca that was very interesting is they used some indigenous traditions that still survive despite hundreds of years of colonialism and genocide, of these sort of community volunteers that went around and helped out. And there's like a very important difference between that and police. They didn't have like a right to have more weapons than other people could have. They didn't have these special privileges where they could just kill people or abuse people if they decided it, and almost certainly get away scot-free. But if they saw some kind of situation that that was problematic, that was harmful, like a building on fire or like a fight, or maybe like even like a situation of domestic violence or something like that, and also something that frequently happened: paramilitaries that were being sent in by the state to attack people. They would call on neighbors to come down into the streets, and so instead of like monopolizing the solution and the typical line from police is move along, like getting people not to look the other way. This tradition, it was actually a way of empowering neighborhoods because it got people to come down into the street and to stop the situation or to look for some kind of resolution together. So that's one view, and there are a lot of organizations in the States that are trying to, like, block by block, create stronger, healthier contacts between neighbors to create some kind of more like transformative justice. So that's out there. A lot of people are working on it. It's real. Yeah.
Nice. Are you working on anything new lately?
Yeah, I'm working on a book that's looking at the ecological crisis, the destruction of the planet, and how the mainstream solutions that are being proposed don't really have any chance of protecting us. How their major focus is actually protecting capitalism, and then regardless of how many people have to die, to protect capitalism, that's their priority. So I'm looking at what are the movements, what are the groups that have been fighting longest to protect the planet, to protect a healthy relationship between people and the land, and what are the visions from those movements, and what would that look like on a global scale? So what's like an actual revolutionary, anti-colonial, ecocentric solution to climate change, to the destruction of the planet?
I got you. So, are there any recommended reads you have for people who are trying to understand the anarchist perspective more, or trying to get more into the anarchist perspective to educate themselves?
Sure, like specifically looking at the current movement, I guess.
Yes.
Yeah. So there's a podcast on a segment on It's Going Down. What might should be done. I'll send you the link to that. There's an interesting article that came out of Minneapolis that looks specifically at the methods that were used to pacify the rebellion there, called Warning, on New Inquiry. I don't think it's specifically anarchist, but definitely very good and very interesting. A book by Vicky Osterweil in Defense of Looting. What else? There's been actually a range of new texts that have come out as well from like a specifically black perspective about anarchism, like Anarcho-Blackness by Marquis Bay, and a lot of other As Black as Resistance. So like a range of
I would love you to send me those.
They look really interesting, and that have a very, very potent view of all these intersections of power, depression, and revolution.
Yeah. You also have a book called Worshipping Power, which I think is very good. I haven't started it completely yet, but that's also a good view for you guys watching if you want to learn a little bit more about the anarchist perspective. Would you be opposed to posting this on your social media, this time with the audio?
Yeah, definitely can, absolutely,
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you for coming on again. Again, I apologize for the first time mess up. I really enjoyed this. I should have this done by the end of the week, if I'm lucky. But I'll send you the link when it gets out. And thank you again for coming out. I really hope you have.
Thanks for inviting me. Thanks for organizing this. And I'll definitely blast the link once you send it to me.
All right, thank you. You have a good day.